Good morning to our Caron YouTube audience, and another good morning to those of you who are here with us in person. And if anybody's around campus watching on the closed circuit, good morning to you as well. I did not really see the role that I serve in coming in my life most of the first part of my life. I was the child of a very wonderful man who I would say would even have self-identified as an alcoholic, my dad, but never pursued the recovery trajectory, even though he did know about it. It's a complicated story. But as the child of my father, and as many boys do, I wanted to emulate pieces of his journey. I aspired to a trajectory that he had aspired to, which was to kind of win in the game of this social sort of setting of his time, which was to have a career. He'd actually changed careers, so he and I have that in common. But anyway, my dad worked for a company long enough that he was headed towards pension, retirement, early retirement. He wanted to retire early and focus on family at that point, and maybe reading or teaching or whatever, which had been his original aspirations. And so that's what I thought. And I remember my dad kind of say, "Go to college and get a job." And those of you who are young don't know, but that was I was given the idea that that was how the world worked, and that you would go to college, you would get a job, you would hopefully work for a great company, something like one of these major companies that probably don't even exist anymore, Xerox. And then you work 20, 25 years and get a pension, and then maybe you could do what I was seeing my dad headed towards. So, first of all, in gracious memory to my dad, John Abel, who I share his name, he passed away a year after his retirement, and at 54. It was really hard on my mom and hard on everybody and on him. So much for that dream, right? Plus, now me, a generation behind him, I sort of followed in those footsteps, but even as I was coming out of college, not only did my life take a different direction for other reasons, but this whole narrative has somewhat evaporated, right? Unless you work in the military and do career military, or you work in a government job, or I think there are still some companies that do try and set this up, but I've known many Caron patients who are, in the 20, 25, 30-year finish of a military journey or whatever, and then they're headed to early retirement, or at least another career option, but they have the pension, they have all that stuff. I don't want to get lost in the economics and the politics of it, but this was my trajectory. I was headed in that direction, and something happened early on that I come by honestly in my family system, which was that I was drinking and doing weed and other dry goods, and those began to overtake my life. I know you've all seen this happen because you wouldn't be in this audience unless you've either suffered it or you have somebody that you've watched go through this hell. But that's what happened. Eventually, I didn't get the career job, and I didn't, start on that career climb ladder, and I didn't, start accumulating pension. And somewhere along the way, I was like, "Ooh, that's not happening." But even as that was not happening, I was becoming more and more. I was quite cavalier about it, and I tried to make it as if I was having a good time, but I was hostage to addiction. And it governed my life. There was an old AA expression, it's not in my outline, but it's a good one, that is first and it's very patriarchal the way it's expressed, but please forgive those things. And I'll only talk about alcohol going forward because I know there are other addictions, but for me to keep it simple, I'm just going to press on. So the old AA expression was, first the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. It's a powerful teaching if you can get past the masculine framing of it. And it's what happened to me. I became taken by the consumption of the substances which held me hostage. And the dreams that I had had, such as they were, began to evaporate. And the priorities of my life rearranged themselves around, this is an NA expression, but it's a getting and using and finding ways and means to get more. I love that expression. It captures what became the driving sort of principle. Every morning, how am I going to do more? How am I going to get more? And if I had to get money, it was money in service of this thing. And if I had to get a job, it was a job in service of this thing. And that might be too much of a gross oversimplification. I know my sister often watches Hungry Men. And I did, but it was so complicated and I can't get lost in the details. Anyway, I was working, but I was also like, I couldn't really dream the dreams of a young man that would have carried me in inspiration and not to, two words, accomplishment and accumulation, right? And that was the thing. I wanted to have the fancy job and I wanted to accumulate the wealth. And I would love to tell you we live in a time when the material accomplishment and material accumulation weren't still dominant narratives, even though the corporate career and the pension thing is like largely gone, but I think we still are being lured by the media and politics in our society to think that now in other ways this is the big prize. Everybody who wins by getting more, and it's accumulation and domination, and whether it's real estate or securities or crypto or whatever, it's still this rat race of accumulation and accomplishment. Maybe it's not for you. God bless you if you've somehow escaped that, but I think this is a lure that many of us suffer from. So, and what I want to talk about today, my topic is servanthood, which, as a young man, I had a mixed image of, because I didn't think of it as attractive for me, but there were oddballs in my family, which we thought of them as oddballs, one of them in particular, my uncle Jim, and it was almost as if, Jim couldn't have done anything else, but he became a Roman Catholic religious brother. And it was like he didn't even become a priest. These diminutive narratives that are pejorative about people who follow helping professions just piss me off, unnerve me. I'm trying to be careful about language, but not always perfect. Anyway, that's the second thing I wanted to say, is that not only is there stigma about addiction, which there surely is, and maybe it's getting better, but I'm not entirely convinced it really is. There is education out there to combat the stigma of addiction, but also I think there's some sort of stigmatization that goes with people who orient their lives towards service. And if you're not sure that's true and you idealize people who take servant roles or whatever, great. But I do think even the term helping professions is somehow as if it's in a category by itself, which it is, but, and I remember feeling like I had to apologize to people when I was like, I'm no longer going to pursue the MBA, like, material accomplishment, and I'm going to seminary, and then being like, you're going to what? And part of that was that they knew me, so they knew it was out of character, but also, I think it was, was implicit in their expectations of me that if I ever got my act together, what I was going to do is I was going to resume the rat race, and go that way. And here I was out, this is all Alcoholics Anonymous' fault, and if you're going to do Dharma recovery or smart recovery, awesome, good for you. But I know that this worked for me, the 12-step thing. And within the 12 steps, curiously, this is one of the things that people struggle with a great deal about the 12 steps. It's one of the reasons why the 12-step path has stigmatization also. It's interesting, stigma we're chasing here today also, is that the 12 steps place a tremendous emphasis on spirituality and service. And when I first was in AA and NA and the other A fellowships that I have benefited from, and I heard this thing about faith and higher power and the sort of relinquishment of the ego and the priority of service to others, I was like, what does that have to do with not drinking? I couldn't make the correlation, but I'm going to help us make it today. Because I think it's really important and interesting and profound, and it speaks to a variety of things that I won't be able to incorporate in the message, but that have to do with people's problems with faith and spirituality in general. How could there be a higher power when there's suffering in the world? All of these, if you follow the thread I'm on, I think there's things to say about these challenges that people have with the idea of a spiritual life. So, there I was, shipwrecked on the shores of addiction, rescued on the raft of addiction recovery, and hearing people tell me what I thought was a raft, of service and faith and spirituality. And I was thinking, like, it sounded like Snoopy to me. Wah, 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 wah. And yet, I remembered my uncle and people that I'd seen in my life who had followed these service-oriented paths. And I had a man in my life. I knew I was going to talk about him today, and I didn't know where in this sequence, but here he comes. His name is Tom Hughes, now long passed away, one of the most significant sponsors in my multi-sponsor recovery journey. Tom was this beautiful, gentle, sweet soul, gay man in a long-term committed relationship, and he had had a banking career. I think that's what he did. But by the time I intersected with Tom, he was already finished with whatever that career was, and he and Mel had set up their household in southern Delaware, which is where I got sober. And Tom's entire life was devoted to his AA footprint. He sponsored tons of people. He and Mel were active in the program. They did have a church life, and actually when I became a pastor, Tom joined my church, which was a switch in denominations that surprised a lot of people for him. But my point about Tom is that he was an example, like other people in my life had been, including my uncle, of people who had oriented their lives not towards the accumulation and accomplishment, but towards connection and service. And those are accumulations and accomplishments, but they're not ones that the society tends to sort of trumpet, right? Because when you accumulate connections, and I don't mean Facebook friends, but it's as if, like, oh, that's what you're going for? And I'm so saddened by this because what I've come to realize the older I get is that my grandchildren that have come to me through my second marriage, and my wife and her incredible mother nature, and people in my life that are creatives or craftspersons who also have been stigmatized because they're like, oh, you're a tradesperson. Like, why do we denigrate the journeys of meaning and fulfillment and connection that are other than Elon Musk's, or, why is that? And there's several problems with valorizing this one sort of approach to accumulation and accomplishment. Among them is that it's a pyramid where only a tiny number of people get to benefit from the satisfaction. But if we would flip it and we would valorize mutual connectedness, then a whole ton of more people can aspire to attainment of the joys of what it means to progress on such paths. And somewhere in this message also belongs survival and Maslow. So, somebody would say, well, you have to have a certain amount of money to live. You absolutely do. And there are really interesting studies about this that suggest, I'm going to say maybe the study I'm referring to is about 10 years ago. I don't know exactly. I didn't look it up. But at that time, when the study was done 10 or so years ago, there was a number, it was like 70 or 75,000. It was a national median for when, if you made less than that number, anxiety and depression were a more significant factor in your life, rather than happiness. But it was a happiness scale measure. Well, the interesting thing was happiness didn't really increase much over the, let's say, $70,000 in annual income for, I think it was a household of two or whatever. So, I don't know if you know this study, but to me it's tremendously compelling because it sort of speaks to the idea that we've been fed a raft of crap that more is going to indefinitely bring more happiness. And the big lottery winners also show us this because their happiness quotient is not as high as you might think. And all you need to do is work here at Caron for a while, and you can see this in a profound way because the slice of the community that we serve has a fairly wide range, but not from people who are indigent. But we serve a lot of people who are at least in that zone where they can meet their basic financial needs, and who are, when we serve people who are way above that. And I will tell you that the people who are way above that are not uniformly much happier. So that's one of the things. The other thing I wanted to say, is like hit me like a ton of bricks in the middle of the week, was that the underlying question of service is not whether we serve, but who and what we serve. And that I think basically human beings have vocational chemistry. We have a vocational apparatus. We are followers. We, like ducks that, like line up behind the mother, we will get in line for something. And for me, that was the brownies at the Dave Matthews Show, which I didn't know what was even in them. Sadly, that's what happened. My attachment, my vocational apparatus, my ability to pursue something became that. It became drugs. And it honestly did. And people looked at me and were like, you have so much potential, dude. And if I can tell you how many times I heard that, and it made me angry, because some part of me knew there was a truth to it, but I was totally captive. That you couldn't wrestle me away from the ugly duckling I was serving. And that's a bad use of that metaphor, but I was, and the neuroscientists talk about a hijacked brain, and this to me is illuminating, because they tell you that the hijacked brain is for pleasure chemistry, right? It's the dopamine upregulation of the substances. And yes, it is true, I found pleasure in the substances initially, but by the time I was doing the substances at the end, I wasn't even finding it especially pleasurable. And they have statistics to show the way that works is sadly neurobiologically true. So if you think you're still getting high to get happy, by the way, then you haven't gotten high enough. Like, your misery is ahead if you don't find recovery and you suffer from this illness. And these shackles are very hard to break. So what happens is that people who love and care about us, who have a calling to be in relationship with us, and become heartbroken and angry and frustrated when we can't answer their pleas for us to hear them and see them and love them and stop this madness, they fall on deaf ears, because all that is being heard inside the soul and brain of the addict is the lure. One more, one more, one more. I know where to get it. I know how to get it. We can even sneak it into Caron. Like, don't raise your hands, but this is the horrid, war that occurs in the phenomenon of addiction and the movement into recovery, is to beat such an enemy. And here's the great news. It happens all the time. This enemy is defeated on a regular basis through treatment and the sustaining interventions of programs of recovery in extraordinary numbers, way higher than we ever admitted or acknowledged. 20 years ago, people were like, oh, you can't even get sober once you're an addict. It's like, and that was part of the stigma. But today, the narratives are changing. Today, Caron's vision statement, I think it's the vision or mission statement, is recovery is not only possible, but probable. And that might be new information for you, but it's true. I was talking with someone here who says if it didn't take one treatment, it might take two, it might take three. There are statistics to say that several treatments may be necessary, but that long-term recovery, if the family and individual persist, is possible. It's sort of like quitting smoking. Just because you tried to quit smoking once and it didn't work, you shouldn't give up. You should keep trying, because on the nth try, you have a higher probability of sustained abstinence. So there is absolute hope of a shift out of the hijacked narrative of accumulation and accomplishment of how I got high, how many times I got high, and what I had to get high with. But what is your alternative? What are you going to allow your vocational nature to become called to? And if you replace that with this dominant narrative of material accomplishment and financial wealth, I will tell you, I believe, I'm an AA'er, that is an unwise choice. And the reason I will say that is that the dopamine upregulations of that are just like addiction. They will, first of all, they will wane. They will wane as you get past whatever milestones pay the bills. And that means that you will have the siren song, I'm going to use Odysseus here for a minute, calling you from the rocks, on the rocks, to get in to enter that world And it will challenge the pleasure of the material, financial, mercantile, media bull. So it's not going to work, people. If you think I'm going to get back to career, I'm going to get back to job, I'm going to get back to money, be careful. Hear what I'm saying. I'm sorry to be so dire in my prediction, but you are replacing a very powerful demon with another one that isn't as powerful in my mind. No matter how hard you push it and no matter how lucky you get at the lottery machine of that kind of life. So the priority of this message is to reorient our lives to meaning and to purpose and to love and to connection and to think about the accumulation that we want as that, as relationship. And I mean real relationship. Not mere acquaintance and certainly not media, social media touch points. So, and I guess one of the things I didn't say there is a lot, listen to my previous messages about servanthood, there's a lot of evidence to support this claim I'm making that the satisfaction from orientation to the other rather than orientation to our own pleasure is better. It's more, you become more resilient. You continue to feel it doesn't wane, like the meaning life doesn't have this problem that eventually it stops being stimulating. And it's accessible to everyone, other than the people who are at subsistence level, who need to first figure out how to pay the bills. And sadly, that's a tough social message, by the way. It makes me want to be moved to help give people a leg up to the point where they too can begin to pay attention to. And I think I want to give the broadest, and then I'll shut up, the broadest notion of what I mean by a service-oriented life, because not everybody needs to be a jack and go from atheist to minister. People always ask me, how did that happen? And sometimes I struggle with answering, but now I know. This is why. It's because I awoke to the call of service, and I found it so unbelievably meaningful that today it beats drugs. And 34 years into my sobriety, you can push a drink in front of me and I will punt it away today. I guarantee you, you are not going to give me the drink today because I get to do this. But musicians serve, teachers serve, parents serve, nurses serve. And all those were the things I was sort of told, don't do that because you're not going to make the money and you're not going to have the career and you're not going to have the retirement. Well, so much for the retirement, by the way. But even those promises are fading. But the promises that I'm telling you about are real promises. They're promises of satisfaction that endures and that is powerful enough to beat this foe. So let's take the invitation that is here in front of us to give and love and stop being shipwrecked on these rocks of meaninglessness that have come to command our very soul. And I make it sound like it's a simple choice, but it becomes that, by the way, if you follow direction. While you're in treatment, you may think, I have to use. You had to use until you got here, unless somebody's bringing you drugs in here. By the way, rat yourself out if that happened. But now this is what you acquire is the capacity of choice again. This is the miracle of recovery, is that we have choice to reorient our lives. And the wisdom of the 12 steps and of behavioral health theory in general, by the way, is that values is the way to go. So, to reorient your life to meaning will bring resilience, satisfaction, hope, love, purpose, all that stuff. I've said everything I want to say, I think, maybe not, but I've said way too much, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.